Imagine waking up one morning in the year 1351 and realizing that half the people you once knew are simply gone. Not traveling, not sleeping late, gone. The bakery that once smelled of fresh bread every morning is closed because the baker died last winter. The church bell still rings, but the priest who used to pull the rope is no longer there. And the field outside the village, the one that once needed 10 workers to harvest, now has only 3. This was the strange and haunting world people stepped into after the Black Death. Between the years 1347 and 1351, historians estimate that the plague killed somewhere between 30 and 50% of Europe's population. Some regions lost even more. The Norwegian historian Ole Benedicto describes it as one of the most devastating disasters in recorded human history. But here is the question that rarely appears in textbooks. What was it actually like to survive? Tonight, we are not following kings or famous generals. Instead, we are stepping quietly into the shoes of the ordinary people who woke up after the storm had passed and had to rebuild a world that suddenly felt empty. But before we wander further into this strange chapter of history, take a quick moment to settle in with me. If you enjoy calm storytelling about the hidden moments of the past, you can gently support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, or sharing it with someone who loves history as much as you do. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight. It is always fascinating to see how stories from medieval Europe travel across the modern world. All right, let us dim the lights a little and step back into the year 1351. At first glance, survival might have felt like a blessing, but for many people it also felt deeply unsettling. Imagine walking through your village and noticing how quiet everything has become. The houses still stand, the wells still hold water, the roads still lead to nearby towns. Yet something important is missing. People, chroniclers from the time described entire streets standing empty. In parts of Italy and France, villages were abandoned completely. In England, records suggest that nearly half of the clergy died during the plague years, leaving churches without priests and communities without spiritual leaders. The famous Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio captured the emotional chaos of the plague in his work called The Decameron. He wrote about families separating out of fear, neighbors avoiding one another, and cities that felt almost ghostly. Now imagine surviving all of that. You are still here, but many of the people who shaped your daily life are not. And yet, something unexpected was quietly beginning to change. In medieval Europe before the plague, most peasants had very little freedom. If you were born on a certain piece of land, chances were you would spend your entire life working that same soil under the authority of a local lord. But after the Black Death, the world suddenly had a very unusual problem. There was too much land, and not enough workers. Fields needed farmers, workshops needed apprentices, cities needed builders, bakers, tailors, carpenters, and blacksmiths. For the first time in generations, ordinary laborers became incredibly valuable. Imagine a farmer who used to compete with dozens of other workers for the same job. Now the landowner might come to him and say something surprising. "Please stay, I will pay you more." It was a quiet revolution. Not the kind with swords or armies, but the kind that slowly changes how a society works. Of course, the powerful people of medieval Europe did not exactly celebrate this new situation. Many landowners quickly realized that surviving workers were beginning to ask for higher wages, and that made them nervous, very nervous. In fact, the year 1351 would soon bring one of the most fascinating attempts in history to control the value of human labor. Governments tried to pass laws forcing workers to accept the same low wages they had earned before the plague. But as we will soon see, when half the workforce disappears, controlling the survivors becomes much harder than writing rules on parchment. And that is where the next chapter of our story begins. Yet while survivors were slowly adjusting to this quieter world, something remarkable was beginning to happen beneath the surface of everyday life. For centuries before the plague, most ordinary workers in Europe had very little negotiating power. A farm laborer worked for the local lord. A craftsman usually stayed in the same town where he had trained. Wages were low, choices were limited, and the social ladder was extremely difficult to climb. But after the great wave of death passed through Europe, the balance of power shifted almost overnight. Think about it for a moment. If half the workers in a region suddenly disappear, who harvests the wheat? Who repairs the roofs? Who builds carts? Shoes, horses, mills, grain, or bakes bread? The answer, quite simply, is whoever is still alive. And suddenly those survivors became very valuable. Historical records from England, northern France, and parts of Italy show that wages began rising quickly after the plague years. Landowners found themselves competing with one another to attract workers. A farmer might leave one village and travel to another where the pay was better. A mason or carpenter might receive offers from several towns that desperately needed rebuilding. For many laborers, it must have felt like stepping into an entirely new world. Imagine a young farm worker who had spent his entire childhood believing he would always remain tied to a single estate. Now, for the first time, he might hear a landowner say something surprising. "If you come work my fields this season, I will pay you twice what you earned before the plague." That kind of opportunity had been almost unthinkable in medieval society. But not everyone welcomed this sudden change. In fact, many powerful landowners were deeply alarmed. In England, the government reacted quickly. In the year 1351, King Edward III approved a law called the Statute of Laborers. Its purpose was very clear. The law ordered that workers must accept the same wages they had earned before the plague. It also tried to prevent laborers from leaving their home villages in search of better pay. In other words, the government attempted to freeze the labor market in time. But here is the fascinating part. Laws can be written quickly. Reality moves much slower. Landowners still needed crops harvested. Sheep still needed tending. Towns still needed buildings repaired. When a roof collapsed or a field sat empty, the parchment law sitting in a royal archive did not fix the problem. Workers did, so in many places the law was quietly ignored. Records from manorial courts in England show landowners secretly paying higher wages despite the official restrictions. Some workers moved between villages anyway, accepting the risk of punishment because the opportunity was simply too good to ignore. One historian described it as a silent tug of war between workers and elites. And in many cases, the workers were slowly winning. This shift did not transform medieval society overnight, but it planted the seeds for something important. Ordinary people were beginning to realize that their labor had value, and that realization would echo through European society for generations. But economic change was only part of the story. Because while wages and opportunities were shifting, everyday life itself was beginning to look very different across the countryside. Entire landscapes were changing. Fields were abandoned. Forests slowly returned, and people began moving in ways they never had before. To truly understand how strange the world after the Black Death became, we need to step outside the cities and walk into the countryside, where the silence of empty land was quietly reshaping medieval life. While wages and jobs were quietly shifting in towns and villages, another transformation was unfolding across the landscape itself. If you had walked through parts of Europe around the year 1351, you might have noticed something unusual. Fields that once grew wheat were slowly turning green with wild grass. Narrow farm paths were fading under weeds. In some places, forests were quietly reclaiming land that farmers had worked for generations. Why? Because there were simply not enough people left to maintain everything. Before the plague, Europe's population had been growing steadily for centuries. Land was crowded, farms were divided among many families, and even small plots were carefully cultivated. But after the Black Death removed nearly half the population, that pressure suddenly disappeared. And when pressure disappears, landscapes change. Many landowners realized that raising sheep required fewer workers than growing grain. So across England, especially large areas of farmland were converted into pasture. Sheep grazed where wheat once stood, producing wool that could be sold in the thriving textile markets of cities like Florence and Bruges. In fact, historians often point to this moment as one of the early steps toward Europe's later economic transformation. But the changes were not only economic, they were deeply personal. Imagine a young woman whose husband died during the plague. In the past, medieval law and tradition often limited women's roles in business or property ownership. Yet the sudden loss of so many men created unexpected gaps in society. Records from towns in England and France show widows inheriting bakeries, managing farms, or running family workshops. In London, some guild documents even record women continuing their husbands' trades after their deaths. Life forced people to adapt. Even movement between regions became more common. Surviving workers sometimes left villages where opportunities were limited and traveled to growing towns or newly available farmland. For people who had once lived their entire lives in a single place, this must have felt like a quiet adventure. Just imagine packing your belongings into a small cart and setting off toward a town you have never seen before, simply because someone there is offering better work. Would you have taken that chance? For many survivors, the answer was yes, and slowly, Europe began to feel less rigid than it had before the plague. But despite these new opportunities, something darker still lingered in people's minds. The great question remained unanswered. Why had the Black Death happened in the first place? Without modern science, the people of the 14th century struggled desperately to explain the disaster that had reshaped their world. Some blamed poisoned air. Others studied the stars, convinced that strange planetary alignments had unleashed the disease. And many people searched for answers in something even more powerful: faith. Because when fear and confusion fill the air, human beings often look for meaning wherever they can find it. And as we will see next, those search for answers would lead medieval society into moments of devotion, desperation, and sometimes tragedy. Even as fields slowly returned to life and towns began to rebuild, the minds of the survivors were still searching for one haunting answer. Why had this happened? Imagine living in a time when no one had ever heard of bacteria or viruses. There were no microscopes, no laboratories, and certainly no modern medicine. Yet millions had died in just a few short years. People needed an explanation. And when science cannot provide, one human imagination often fills the silence. Some medieval scholars believed the plague came from what they called corrupted air. Doctors recommended carrying sweet-smelling herbs or flowers to protect oneself from dangerous vapors. In fact, centuries later, this belief would inspire the famous plague doctor masks, with long beaks filled with aromatic plants. Other thinkers looked upward. A medical report written by scholars at the University of Paris in the year 1348 argued that a rare alignment of the planets Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars had disturbed the natural balance of the Earth's atmosphere. According to them, the heavens themselves might have unleashed the disease. It sounds strange to us today, but remember, astrology and medicine were closely connected in the medieval world. Yet for many ordinary people, the explanation felt far more spiritual. Across Europe, a powerful belief spread that the plague was a punishment from God. If that were true, then perhaps suffering could earn forgiveness. This idea gave rise to one of the most dramatic religious movements of the time, the Flagellants. Groups of men traveled from town to town, walking barefoot through the streets while publicly whipping themselves. They believed that acts of extreme repentance might convince God to end the plague. Picture the scene: a quiet town square, church bells ringing slowly, and a long procession of men chanting prayers while striking their backs with ropes or chains. For frightened communities, these processions must have felt both terrifying and strangely hopeful. But fear can also push societies toward darker paths. In several regions of Europe, rumors began spreading that certain minority communities were somehow responsible for the plague. Jewish communities were falsely accused of poisoning wells, even though there was no evidence at all. These accusations led to violent persecutions in parts of Germany, France, and Switzerland. Entire communities were expelled or attacked during the chaos of the plague years. Today, historians recognize these events as tragic examples of how fear and misunderstanding can turn neighbors against one another. Yet even in those difficult times, there were also voices of reason. Some city leaders and church officials tried to protect vulnerable communities, reminding people that the true cause of the plague was still unknown. Slowly, as the years passed and the waves of disease became less intense, life began to steady again. Markets reopened, trade routes revived. Children were born into a world that was scarred, but still moving forward. And little by little, the survivors began to understand something profound. The plague had not only taken lives, it had quietly changed the structure of society itself. The effects of those changes would continue unfolding for decades, eventually leading to new tensions, new opportunities, and even open rebellion. Because when ordinary people begin to realize their own value in society, history has a funny way of becoming very interesting. And that realization would soon lead Europe toward one of the most dramatic social turning points of the medieval world. As the years quietly moved forward after 1351, the true impact of the Black Death began revealing itself in ways that few people at the time could fully understand. At first, the changes felt small: a worker asking for slightly higher wages, a farmer deciding to move to a new village, a widow continuing to run her family's shop. But when thousands of people begin making small choices like these, something remarkable happens. Society itself starts to shift. One of the clearest examples of this slow transformation appeared a few decades later in England. By the late 14th century, many peasants had grown increasingly aware of their value in the economy. Labor was still scarce, wages had risen in many places, and workers were beginning to question the old rules that kept them tied to powerful landowners. Then, in the year 1381, tension finally reached a breaking point. What historians now call the Peasants' Revolt began when thousands of ordinary people marched toward London, demanding fair treatment, lower taxes, and greater freedom. Among their leaders was a man named Wat Tyler, whose name would become famous in English history. Now imagine the shock this must have caused among the ruling class. For centuries, the social order of medieval Europe had seemed unshakable. Kings ruled above nobles, nobles ruled over peasants, and most people were expected to remain in the social position they were born into. But the Black Death had quietly weakened that structure. When half the population disappears, the rules that once controlled everyone suddenly become harder to enforce. Workers begin asking questions. Why should we accept the same wages as before when our labor is now rare? Why should we remain tied to the same land when opportunities exist elsewhere? These questions were powerful. And once people begin asking them, history rarely stands still. Of course, the Peasants' Revolt itself did not completely overturn medieval society. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, and many of its leaders were killed. Yet historians often point out that the ideas behind the revolt never fully disappeared. The survivors of the Black Death had experienced something unusual. They had seen how fragile the old system could be, and they had learned that their work truly mattered. Over time, this realization slowly reshaped Europe's economy, social structure, and even political thinking. And when we step back and look at the bigger picture, something fascinating becomes clear. The generation that survived the Black Death was unknowingly helping create the conditions for the world that would follow. A world where trade expanded, cities grew stronger, and new cultural movements like the Renaissance would eventually begin to flourish. But perhaps the most powerful part of this story is also the simplest. After unimaginable loss, people continued living. They rebuilt farms, they reopened markets, they raised children, and they carried forward the quiet resilience that human history is built upon. Which brings us to the final reflection of our journey tonight, where the survivors of 1351 leave us with a lesson that still feels surprisingly relevant today. And so, as the dust of the plague years slowly settled, Europe entered a quieter but deeply important chapter of its history. By the middle of the 14th century, the worst wave of the Black Death had passed, but its shadow remained everywhere. Villages were smaller, families were fewer, and many survivors carried memories that must have felt almost impossible to describe. Imagine living through a time when nearly everyone you knew had lost someone close, a brother, a neighbor, a teacher, a child. Yet despite all that loss, people continued moving forward. Fields were planted again. Markets reopened. Church bells rang for weddings instead of funerals. Life, in its stubborn and remarkable way, refused to disappear. Historians often point out something fascinating about the decades that followed the plague. Europe did not simply recover. In many ways, it began to transform. With fewer workers, available wages in many regions slowly increased. Labor became more valuable than it had been for centuries. Some peasants gained the ability to negotiate better conditions or move to towns where opportunities were greater. Cities began growing again as trade routes reopened. Merchants carried wool, wine, spices, and cloth across long distances. The rhythm of daily life slowly returned to markets and ports that had once fallen silent. Even the way people thought about medicine and public health began to change. City governments in places like Venice and Milan started experimenting with early quarantine systems. Ships arriving from distant ports were sometimes required to wait outside the city for several weeks before passengers could enter. It was not perfect, but it represented one of the first organized attempts to control the spread of disease. In fact, the word quarantine itself comes from the Italian phrase 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. 40 days of waiting, just to make sure sickness did not follow travelers into the city. Moments like this remind us that even in the 14th century, people were learning from tragedy. Slowly, carefully, they were trying to build a safer world. And perhaps that is one of the most powerful lessons from the survivors of 1351. They could not undo what had happened. They could not bring back the millions who had died, but they could adapt. They could rebuild. They could plant seeds for a future they themselves might never fully see. Historians today sometimes describe the Black Death as one of the events that helped push Europe toward the early modern world. Labor systems changed. Cities gained influence. Trade networks expanded. And within the next century, new intellectual movements like the Renaissance would begin to reshape art, science, and culture across the continent. Of course, the people living through those years did not know they were standing at the edge of such transformation. They were simply survivors, ordinary men and women waking up each day, repairing broken homes, tending fields, raising children, and learning how to live again after unimaginable loss. When we look back across the centuries, their resilience feels almost heroic. Not the loud heroism of battlefields and crowns, but the quiet courage of continuing, of rebuilding a bakery after the baker is gone, of reopening a market stall after months of silence, of planting crops in soil that once held far too many graves. History often celebrates the dramatic moments, but sometimes the most meaningful victories are the quiet ones. And the survival of Europe after the Black Death may be one of the greatest quiet victories in human history. If you enjoyed stepping back into this remarkable chapter of the past, thank you for spending these moments here and listening to the story. Your curiosity keeps these forgotten worlds alive. And if you enjoy thoughtful journeys through history like this one, stay close, because there are many more fascinating stories waiting just ahead. Until our next exploration of the past, thank you for listening. And I look forward to sharing another story with you very soon.